This is a Salvia Divinorum 20x trip report by sdavid, posted to arrowwood.org on February 13th, 2014. It was an April afternoon in 2006, and the sky was a clear blue, the kind of blue that makes you think the whole world is made of light. My parents were away on holiday, leaving the house quiet and empty. My best friend at the time, Mark, was over, and he had brought his younger brother, Alex, who was 12 and full of restless energy. We had spent the morning wandering around the garden, arguing about video games and music, and by early afternoon we decided that we wanted to try something new. We had bought a small packet of Salvia Divinorum that was labeled 20x. The packaging was plain, the leaf dried and crushed into a fine powder that smelled bitter and earthy. We had heard stories about how strong it could be, but our only reference point was marijuana, which we had smoked many times before. I thought I knew what to expect. A short, strange buzz, maybe some visual distortion, nothing that would last more than an hour. In hindsight, I was terribly underprepared. Because the house was empty, we felt free to do something a little reckless. We set up a small camping tent in the back garden, a cheap pop-up that we had used once before for a backyard sleepover. The tent was small, just big enough for 3 people to sit inside, and it had a thin fabric wall that let in the scent of the grass and the distant hum of insects. We thought the tent would give us a private space, a place where we could smoke without worrying about the house or the neighbors. I did not think about the size of the tent, the lack of ventilation, or the fact that the fabric would trap the smoke. I only thought it would be a fun, secret little room. We gathered a small pipe, a glass hand-held piece that we had used for weed before. The pipe was simple, a straight tube with a small bowl at one end. I measured out a pinch of the salvia powder, enough for a single hit, and placed it in the bowl. The powder was dry and crumbly, and as soon as I lit it, the flame caught the edges and produced a thin gray smoke that smelled of bitter herbs and something metallic. The first inhalation was harsh. The smoke burned my throat and left a bitter aftertaste that lingered on my tongue. I held the smoke in for a moment and then exhaled. Nothing happened. I opened my eyes and looked at Mark and Alex, who were watching me with curious faces. I felt a little foolish, as if I had just wasted a minute of my day. I took a second hit, almost as a test. This time the smoke seemed denser, the taste even more bitter. I inhaled again, this time holding the breath a little longer, trying to let the chemical reach deeper into my lungs. As soon as the smoke entered my bloodstream, I felt a strange sensation spread through my body. It was as if a low-frequency current was running along every nerve, a tingling that was both numb and painful, like pins and needles pressed against my skin at the same time. My muscles tightened involuntarily, as if an invisible rope had been attached to each limb and was pulling me in different directions. I felt a strong awareness of gravity, but not the ordinary pull that keeps my feet on the ground. Instead, I sensed something in my lower abdomen dragging me down and to the left, as if a weight was attached to my belly and was trying to drag me into the earth. The feeling was unsettling, like being strapped to a seat on a roller coaster that had not yet begun its motion. Mark watched me with a grin, his eyes bright. Alex giggled, unaware of the seriousness of what was happening. I tried to speak. My voice came out hoarse and thin. I told them that it felt like an electric shock, that my body was being pulled, that I could feel the rope. They laughed and said it was just the start. I took a third hit, hoping the sensation would intensify or become clearer. The smoke was harsher this time, the bitter taste more pronounced. I inhaled, feeling the same tingling, but this time the feeling spread faster, moving up my spine, across my shoulders, down my arms. I could not stop the shiver that traveled through my chest. It was as if 1,000 tiny needles were dancing across my skin, each one buzzing with a low hum. For a few seconds after the third inhalation, I felt nothing but a strange emptiness. My eyes were open, but I could not focus on anything. The tent walls seemed to dissolve into a vague gray haze. The world around me became a flat, featureless void. It was not darkness. There was no blackness, no light. It was simply the absence of any visual information, as if the brain had turned off its visual processing. I felt as though I were floating in a space that existed before the universe began, a place where time did not exist, where there was no up or down, no left or right. The feeling lasted what seemed like an eternity, though in reality it was only a few seconds. My heart beat slowly, each thump echoing in my ears like a distant drum. Then, without warning, a flood of images crashed into my mind. I saw my entire life up until that point, from the first day I learned to walk to the present afternoon, playing out in rapid succession. The scenes repeated over and over, each loop slightly different, as if a film strip were being rewound and played again and again. I saw my childhood home, the kitchen table where my mother cooked, the school hallway where I laughed with friends, the first time I rode a bike without training wheels. The images were not clear photographs. They were more like impressions, colors, and shapes that shifted as quickly as a flickering candle flame. The repetition was endless, an infinite loop that stretched beyond any sense of time. After this endless loop, I felt a sudden shift. I was no longer in the void, but in a space that seemed both familiar and alien. It was as if I had stepped through a veil into a version of the world that had been altered by a painter who had used a tilt-shift lens. The landscape was a bright, vivid green, the color of fresh grass in midsummer, but it was exaggerated, almost neon. The sky was a deep, saturated yellow, like the light at the height of noon, but it seemed to curve around the horizon in a way that made the world feel like a dome. The hills rose and fell in smooth, rounded shapes, each one looking like a miniature model in a museum display. The whole scene seemed to be made of layers that repeated, each layer slightly offset from the one before, creating a sense of depth that was both endless and confined. My field of view changed dramatically. It was no longer limited to the narrow cone that my eyes normally provide. I could see everything around me as if I had 100 pairs of eyes spread over my head, each one looking in a different direction. The periphery was as clear as the center. I could see the back of the tent, the ground beneath my feet, the sky above, all at once. It was as if I were a fly perched on a leaf, able to look in all directions simultaneously. The sensation was disorienting, but also oddly natural. I did not think about my eyes. I simply experienced the world as a total panorama. In this expanded vision I saw Mark and Alex, but they were no longer the people I recognized. They stood directly in front of me, though they had been to my left and right a moment before. Their bodies seemed to be made of light, their skin glowing with an orange hue that reminded me of the surface of the sun during a slow solar flare. Their hair was also bright, like strands of fire, and their clothing was a deep, rich purple that seemed to absorb and reflect the surrounding light at the same time. Their eyes were the most striking feature. They were large, almond-shaped, and shone with a metallic sheen, like the eyes of a hawk or the ancient Egyptian god Horus. The eyes were both feminine and fierce, and they seemed to contain entire galaxies within them. When they looked at me, I felt as if they were looking into my soul, as if they could see every thought I had ever had. I felt a strange mixture of awe and terror. The two figures stood like statues, yet they were alive, their breathing slow and measured. They seemed to be both part of the landscape and separate from it. The hills behind them were made of the same purple material, and the hills themselves seemed to be composed of countless tiny versions of those figures, each one repeating endlessly into the distance. The scene felt like a painting that was moving ever so slightly, each brushstroke breathing in and out. The gravity that I had felt earlier reappeared, but it was different now. It was not a force pulling me down. It was a dark, swirling vortex located to my left and slightly below me, as if a black hole had opened in the ground. I could sense its presence, a heavy pull that threatened to draw me in if I looked directly at it. I forced my attention away, focusing instead on the two figures in front of me. Their gaze held me captive. I could not look away. Their eyes seemed to follow my every movement, even though I was not moving. It was as if they were watching a child who had wandered into a dangerous place. But at the same time, they were the child, innocent and frightened. The sense of time was completely broken. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes, minutes into what felt like hours. I could not tell how long I had been standing there, but the world around me did not change. The bright green hills, the yellow sky, the purple figures, the black vortex, all remained static, like a photograph that had been frozen at the exact moment of capture. Yet there was a subtle movement, a slow undulation of the colors, as if the entire scene were breathing. I tried to speak, to ask Mark or Alex what was happening, but no sound came out. My throat felt dry, and the air inside the tent was thick with the lingering taste of bitter smoke. I realized that I could not hear any external sounds either. The world was silent, an absolute quiet that pressed against my ears. The silence amplified every tiny sensation, the tingling in my fingers, the pressure of the rope-like pull in my abdomen, the faint vibration of my heartbeat. My mind began to wander, trying to make sense of the images. I thought about the stories of Plato's cave, about prisoners who only see shadows on a wall and mistake them for reality. In my mind, the two figures were like the fire that the prisoners see, a source of light that reveals the true nature of the world. Yet the fire in my vision was not warm. It was a cold, poisonous glow that seemed to drain color from everything it touched. Their eyes, bright and all-seeing, reminded me of the eye of Sauron, a single point of focus that could pierce through any illusion. I felt as if I were being judged, as if the two beings were measuring my worth, my fear, my curiosity. The feeling of being observed was not just external. I sensed another presence, a version of myself that was older, more aware, watching the child I had become. It was as if my adult subconscious had stepped into the scene, taking the place of a father watching his child in danger. I could feel the protective instinct of that older self, the urge to pull the child away from the black vortex, to shield him from the poisonous light. At the same time, I felt the child's panic, the instinctual terror of being in a place that did not make sense. The two parts of me were in conflict, each pulling in the opposite directions, each demanding that I either flee or stay, each whispering a different answer to the same question. My adult self tried to pull the child away from the black vortex, to shield him from the poisonous light. The child within me screamed, his breath shallow, his heart thudding like a drum in a hollow hall. I could feel the tug of both forces on the rope of my own spine, each pull a different electric shock, each shock a reminder that I was being stretched beyond any normal limit. At that moment, the world around me seemed to dissolve into a thin film of color. The green of the grass that had filled the horizon in the first vision turned a deep, almost phosphorescent hue, and the yellow that had bathed the hills became a bright, flickering gold that seemed to pulse in time with my pulse. The sky, which I could not see because my field of view now wrapped around me like a sphere, was filled with a soft, humming light that did not come from any direction. It was as if the light lived inside me, radiating outward through every cell, through every nerve, through the very air that I could not feel. My breath became shallow and rapid, as if the air itself had become thin. I could feel the muscles in my jaw clenching, my shoulders tightening, my fingers digging into the fabric of the tent, as if they might anchor me to something solid. The tent walls, which had seemed like ordinary canvas moments before, now appeared as a membrane of shimmering threads, each thread vibrating with a faint, high-pitched tone. The sound was not audible, but I could sense it in my bones, a low hum that seemed to resonate with the hum inside my head. The two entities that had been watching me, the ones with the orange flame hair and the purple robes, began to change. Their eyes, which had seemed like mirrors of a Hindu painting, now opened wider, the pupils dilating until they were almost black holes themselves. Their gaze did not feel threatening. Instead, it felt like an invitation, a silent question that I could not answer with words. I felt my adult self step back, allowing the child to approach, to be close enough to feel the heat of those eyes. I moved forward, though I did not know if I was walking or simply being pulled. The ground beneath me, which had felt like a black hole pulling me down and left, now felt like a soft, pliable surface that gave under each step, like stepping on a thick carpet of moss. Each step produced a faint ripple that traveled outward, distorting the colors around me. The hills, which had seemed tilt-shifted and surreal, now unfolded like layers of paper, each layer a slightly different shade of green, each layer moving independently, yet all moving together in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The feeling of gravity changed again. It was no longer a pull to the left. It became a gentle pressure that seemed to come from all sides, as if the universe itself were pressing me into a single point. I could feel my spine elongating, the vertebrae stretching, the muscles in my back lengthening. My head felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from my skull. The sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating. I could not tell whether I was still inside the tent or had been transported to a place that existed beyond any physical location. The peak of the experience arrived not as a single event, but as a cascade of sensations that overlapped and reinforced each other. The visual field was saturated with color, the auditory field filled with a silent vibration, The tactile field flooded with a sense of weightlessness. My mind, which had been trying to parse the scene into familiar categories, gave up. Words fell away, and I was left with pure perception. I could see the edges of my thoughts like thin lines of light that flickered and then vanished. I could feel the boundaries of my emotions like thin membranes that stretched and snapped. In this state, I became aware of a pattern that repeated itself in the background of everything I saw. It was a series of concentric circles, each one slightly larger than the last, each one rotating slowly in the opposite direction of the one inside it. The circles were not drawn. They were made of the very fabric of the space I occupied. As I watched, the circles began to converge toward the center, a point that glowed with an intensity that made the surrounding colors dim. The point seemed to be the source of all the light, all the color, all the vibration. It was both a destination and a source, a beginning and an end. My adult self, the observer, seemed to merge with the child. I could not tell where one ended and the other began. The protective instinct faded, replaced by a pure curiosity that felt like a child reaching out to touch a new toy. I reached out, though there was no hand to move, and I felt a pressure against my chest, as if something solid had pressed against me. The pressure was warm, like the heat of a sun that had not yet burned. It seemed to pulse in time with the circles, each pulse a beat that echoed through my entire body. At the moment the circles finally met, the entire landscape collapsed inward. The hills folded like paper being pressed together, the colors bled into each other, the light dimmed to a dull white that was also black. The collapse was not violent. It was a smooth, inevitable folding, as if the universe were a sheet of fabric being rolled into a ball. My sense of self was caught in that fold, and for an instant I felt as if I were being compressed into a single point, a point that contained all the memories, all the sensations, all the fears, all the wonder. When the folding completed, there was a brief moment of absolute stillness. The white-black light faded, and I found myself back inside the tent, or at least in a space that resembled the interior of the tent. The canvas walls were still there, the rope that held the tent together still taut. The smell of the bitter smoke lingered in the air, a faint, acrid scent that clung to my nostrils. My heart was pounding, my breathing ragged, my skin slick with sweat that I could not feel as cold or warm, only as a wetness that clung to my arms. The plateau began at that point. The intense surge of color and vibration receded, leaving behind a lingering afterglow that was less bright but still present. My vision returned to normal, though the edges of my sight still held a faint halo, a ghost of the 360-degree view I had experienced. The sound of the world outside the tent, the distant chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves, seemed louder than before, as if my ears had been tuned to a higher sensitivity. I sat on the floor of the tent, my back against the canvas, my hands clutching the edge of the rope. The tent seemed to pulse gently, as if the fabric itself were still resonating from the collapse. I could feel the rope digging into my fingers, each knot a reminder of the tension that had held the whole structure together. My mind, which had been frantic during the peak, now settled into a slow, steady rhythm. Thoughts came in short bursts, each one a simple statement. I am here. I am breathing. I am alive. The complexity of the earlier visions faded, leaving behind a simple awareness of my own body. The plateau lasted for several minutes, perhaps longer. Time no longer felt like a line. It felt like a thick, viscous fluid that moved slowly, dragging my thoughts with it. I could feel the after effects of the electrical current that had run through my body at the beginning of the experience. My limbs were numb in places, tingling in others, as if tiny pins were pressing against my skin. The sensation was not painful, but it was uncomfortable, a reminder that my body had been pushed beyond its normal limits. I became aware of a subtle pressure in my abdomen, a feeling that something was pulling me down and to the left, as it had at the start. This time, however, the pressure was not frightening. It felt like a gentle reminder that the world still had gravity, that my body was still anchored to the earth. I tried to focus on that feeling, to use it as a grounding point. I inhaled slowly, counting each breath, feeling the air fill my lungs, feeling the rise and fall of my chest. With each exhale, I imagined the lingering color of the landscape folding away, returning to the plain gray of the tent walls. As the plateau faded, the come-down began. The vivid afterglow dimmed further, The halo around my vision disappeared, and my peripheral vision returned to its normal narrow field. The humming vibration in my bones lessened, becoming a faint thrum that I could almost ignore. My heart rate slowed, though it remained faster than it had been before the experience. I felt a lingering sense of disorientation, as if I had walked a long distance in a fog and was now emerging into clear air. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling weak, as if they had not carried my weight for some time. The tent floor felt uneven. The rope under my hands felt rough. I could hear the faint rustle of the garden outside, the wind moving through the leaves, the distant hum of traffic. The world outside the tent seemed colder, more solid, more real than the surreal landscape I had just left. The summer colors that had filled my mind now seemed like a memory of a dream, bright and distant. I stumbled toward the zip that I remembered from the collapse. My hand found the metal latch, cold and slick with condensation. I pulled it open, the sound of the metal sliding against the metal echoing in the small space. I stepped out of the tent, onto the grass that was now damp with dew. The grass felt like a carpet of tiny needles against my bare feet, each blade a sharp point that made me wince. The air was cool, a sharp contrast to the warm, radiant light that had filled the landscape moments before. I could see the sky, a pale blue that seemed almost white, the sun low on the horizon, casting long shadows. The coldness of the outside world struck me like a physical blow. My skin shivered, my teeth clenched. I felt an urge to curl back into the tent, to hide from the harsh light, but my adult self, the observer, pushed me forward. I walked toward the house, each step deliberate, each footfall echoing in the quiet afternoon. The garden was empty, the flowers wilted, the leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. I could feel the weight of the experience pressing on me, a heaviness in my chest that made each breath a small effort. I entered the house, the door closing behind me with a soft click. The interior was dim, the curtains drawn, the furniture casting long shadows. I collapsed onto the sofa, the cushions hard against my back, the fabric rough under my skin. I lay there in an embryonic position, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around my shins. The sofa felt abrasive, the wood underneath cold. I could hear my own breathing, loud in the quiet room, the sound of my heart beating in my ears. My friends, who had been with me inside the tent, followed me inside. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide, their expressions a mixture of concern and confusion. I could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear I had felt when I saw the two entities. I snapped at them, my voice sharp, demanding that they leave. Their presence felt like an intrusion, a reminder that I was still in the ordinary world. I asked them to go home, and they obliged, leaving the house one by one, their footsteps fading down the hallway. After they left, I lay on the sofa for a long time. The room seemed to pulse with a low, steady rhythm, as if the walls themselves were breathing. I tried to sleep, but my mind would not settle. Images of the landscape flickered behind my closed eyes, each one a fragment of the color, each one a fragment of the entity's eyes. I could not shake the feeling that the child inside me was still trapped somewhere in that beautiful hell, that the innocence that had been ripped away was still waiting for release. The hours passed slowly. The sunlight shifted, the shadows lengthened, the room grew darker. I eventually fell into a light, restless sleep, my body trembling as if I were still being pulled by an unseen rope.